Captain Sarah Mitchell had dreamed of flying the Apache helicopter since she was 12 years old. Growing up near Fort Campbell, she watched the powerful aircraft slice through Kentucky skies during training exercises. The thunderous roar of the twin engines and the deadly precision of the gunship filled her with an ambition that would shape her entire life. 20 years later, Sarah stood at the edge of the flight line at Fort Hood, Texas, watching her fellow pilots prepare their Apache helicopters for another training mission. Her flight suit hung in her locker, unworn for the past 6 months. The gold wings on her chest felt heavy with the weight of broken dreams and shattered expectations. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac as Sarah remembered the day everything changed. It had started like any other training flight. She was the co-pilot and gunner in the front seat of the Apache, with Major Tom Reynolds commanding from the back. They were practicing close air support missions, working with ground troops to simulate real combat scenarios. The exercise was going perfectly until the radio crackled with an emergency call. A civilian aircraft had suffered engine failure and was making an emergency landing at a nearby airstrip. The pilot was inexperienced and panicking. Local emergency services were 20 minutes away, but the Apache could reach the scene in under 5 minutes. Major Reynolds hesitated. Their orders were clear: stick to the training mission. Deviating from approved flight paths without authorization was strictly forbidden. But Sarah could hear the terror in the civilian pilot's voice over the radio. A young father with his 2 children aboard, desperately trying to keep his small plane in the air. Without waiting for permission, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her career. She took control of the aircraft and diverted toward the emergency. Major Reynolds protested, but Sarah was already banking the Apache toward the coordinates they had intercepted from the emergency frequency. They arrived to find a small Cessna spiraling toward a cluster of farm buildings. Sarah used the Apache's powerful searchlight to guide the civilian pilot toward a clear field. She talked him through the emergency landing procedures over the radio, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos unfolding below. The Cessna touched down hard but safely in the wheat field. The father and his 2 young daughters walked away without serious injury. Emergency services arrived minutes later to transport them to the hospital for observation. Sarah and Major Reynolds had saved 3 lives that day, but their heroic actions came at a devastating cost. By the time they returned to base, a full investigation was already underway. Sarah had violated direct orders, deviated from an authorized mission, and used military aircraft for an unauthorized rescue operation. The fact that she had saved lives didn't matter to the review board. The hearing lasted 3 days. Sarah sat in her dress uniform, listening as her commanding officers dissected every decision she had made that afternoon. They questioned her judgment, her ability to follow orders, and her fitness for duty. The Apache program demanded absolute precision and unwavering adherence to protocol. There was no room for cowboys who thought they knew better than their superiors. Major Reynolds testified that he had tried to stop her, that she had ignored his commands and taken unauthorized control of the aircraft. The investigation revealed that Sarah had a history of pushing boundaries, of making split-second decisions that sometimes conflicted with established procedures. They painted a picture of a reckless pilot who couldn't be trusted with the most sophisticated attack helicopter in the American arsenal. The verdict was swift and merciless. Sarah was immediately grounded from all Apache operations. Her security clearance was suspended pending further review. She was reassigned to a desk job in the base motor pool, managing vehicle maintenance schedules and parts inventory. The woman who had spent years mastering the complexities of attack helicopter warfare was reduced to filing paperwork and answering phones. The other pilots avoided her in the mess hall. Some whispered that she was a hero, but most agreed that she had gotten what she deserved. The military ran on discipline and order. Without strict adherence to the chain of command, chaos would follow. Sarah had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Months passed in bureaucratic limbo. Sarah's appeals were denied at every level. Her requests for transfer were ignored. She watched from her office window as new pilots arrived for Apache training, eager young officers who reminded her of herself just a few years earlier. They had no idea that the woman processing their equipment requests had once been considered one of the finest Apache pilots on the base. Sarah's career seemed over before it had truly begun. The dreams of combat missions and protecting ground troops were replaced by the mundane reality of military bureaucracy. She considered resigning her commission, but something deep inside refused to give up. She had saved those lives for a reason, and somehow, someday, she would fly again. The months in the motor pool felt like years to Sarah. Each morning, she watched the Apache helicopters take off for training missions while she sorted through maintenance reports and supply requisitions. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now responsible for ensuring the very aircraft she was banned from flying had proper parts and service schedules. Her supervisor, Sergeant First Class Williams, was a gruff veteran who had spent 15 years in vehicle maintenance before a back injury ended his field duties. He watched Sarah struggle with the mundane paperwork and saw the frustration building behind her professional facade. "You know," Williams said one afternoon as Sarah stared out the window at the flight line, "I heard what you did up there. Saved a family." Sarah turned from the window, surprised. Most people avoided discussing her situation. "Orders are orders, Sergeant. I should have followed protocol." Williams leaned back in his chair and studied her carefully. "My brother was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. Told me once that the best pilots weren't the ones who followed every rule perfectly. They were the ones who knew when to break the rules for the right reasons." The conversation planted a seed of hope in Sarah's mind, but she pushed it aside. Hope was dangerous when your career was hanging by a thread. She focused on her work, becoming the most efficient parts coordinator the motor pool had ever seen. If she couldn't fly, she would at least excel at whatever job they gave her. 3 months into her exile, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, appeared in the motor pool office one Tuesday morning. Williams scrambled to attention, but the colonel waved him off. "Captain Mitchell, walk with me," Colonel Martinez said simply. They strolled across the base in silence, past the barracks and training facilities toward the flight line. Sarah's heart raced as they approached the Apache hangars. She hadn't been this close to the aircraft in months. "Do you regret what you did that day?" Colonel Martinez asked as they stopped in front of an Apache undergoing maintenance. Sarah considered the question carefully. It was clearly a test, but she decided to answer honestly. "No, sir. I regret how I did it, but not that I did it. Those children are alive because we were there." Colonel Martinez nodded slowly. "The review board recommended that you be discharged from service. Did you know that?" Sarah's stomach dropped. She hadn't known her situation was that precarious. "No, sir. I refused to sign the discharge papers. You made a mistake in procedure, but your instincts were sound. However, that doesn't change the fact that you disobeyed direct orders and violated flight protocols. Trust has to be rebuilt." They stood in silence, watching the maintenance crew work on the Apache's complex systems. Sarah wanted to ask about her future, about whether she would ever fly again, but she knew better than to push for information the colonel wasn't ready to give. "I'm assigning you to a new position," Colonel Martinez continued. "You'll be working with the Base Safety Office, investigating aircraft incidents and near misses. You'll review every emergency situation that occurs on this base and determine what went right and what went wrong." It wasn't flying, but it was closer to aviation than managing spare parts. Sarah felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet, Captain. This job comes with a condition. You'll be working directly under Major Patricia Hayes. She's tough, she's fair, and she doesn't suffer fools gladly. If you can prove to her that you've learned from your mistakes, she might recommend you for flight status review." Major Hayes turned out to be exactly as advertised. A veteran pilot with over 3,000 flight hours, she had survived 3 deployments and earned a reputation for being one of the most competent officers on the base. She was also notoriously difficult to impress. Sarah's first case involved a near collision between 2 training aircraft. As she reviewed the flight data and interviewed the pilots, she began to understand the complexity of the decisions that pilots faced every day. The investigation revealed that both pilots had followed protocol exactly, but a communication breakdown in the control tower had created a dangerous situation. "What's your recommendation?" Major Hayes asked after Sarah presented her findings. "Additional radio procedures and redundant communication protocols," Sarah replied. "Also, enhanced training for air traffic controllers on emergency frequency management." Major Hayes studied the report carefully. "And if you had been one of those pilots?" Sarah knew this was another test. "I would have followed protocol and trusted the system, ma'am. But I would have also been prepared to take evasive action if the situation deteriorated. Even if it meant deviating from your assigned flight path. If it meant preventing a collision, yes, ma'am. But I would have immediately communicated my actions to the control tower and requested emergency clearance." Major Hayes made a note in Sarah's file. It was the first sign that her new supervisor might be willing to work with her rather than against her. Over the following months, Sarah threw herself into safety investigations with the same intensity she had once brought to flight training. She studied every incident, analyzed every near miss, and developed comprehensive recommendations for preventing future problems. Her reports were detailed, thoughtful, and demonstrated a deep understanding of both aviation procedures and human factors. More importantly, the work was changing her perspective on military aviation. She began to see the bigger picture, understanding how individual decisions affected the entire system. The discipline and protocol she had once chafed against now made sense as part of a larger framework designed to protect both pilots and civilians. After 8 months in the safety office, Sarah had investigated over 30 aircraft incidents and earned a grudging respect for Major Hayes. Her reports had led to significant improvements in training procedures and emergency protocols. She had found her place in the military hierarchy, even if it wasn't where she had originally planned to be. The call came on a Thursday morning in late September. Major Hayes walked into Sarah's office with an expression she couldn't read. "Pack your bags, Mitchell. We're going to Fort Bragg for a week." "What's a Bragg?" Sarah asked, closing the incident file she had been reviewing. "Joint training exercise with special operations. They've requested a safety observer for some high-risk helicopter operations. You're the most qualified person I have who isn't currently flying." The backhanded compliment stung, but Sarah recognized the opportunity. Fort Bragg was home to some of the most elite military units in the world. If she could prove herself in that environment, it might open doors that had seemed permanently closed. They flew to North Carolina the next morning. Sarah hadn't been in any aircraft for almost a year, and the simple act of being airborne again filled her with emotions she had tried to suppress. As the transport plane descended toward Fort Bragg, she could see helicopters conducting training operations across the sprawling base. The briefing took place in a nondescript conference room filled with Army Rangers, Special Forces operators, and naval aviators. The operation they were planning was complex, a simulated rescue mission in hostile territory, with multiple aircraft coordinating at night in difficult terrain. Captain Jake Morrison, the mission commander, explained the scenario. A high-value target had been captured behind enemy lines. Intelligence suggested the prisoner was being held in a remote compound surrounded by anti-aircraft defenses. The rescue team would have to insert via helicopter, extract the target, and escape before enemy reinforcements arrived. "The margin for error is essentially zero," Captain Morrison explained. "We're dealing with narrow landing zones, limited visibility, and precise timing requirements. Any mistakes could result in casualties." Sarah listened carefully, taking notes on the safety implications of each phase of the operation. As the briefing continued, she began to identify potential problems that the planners might have overlooked. During the break, she approached Captain Morrison with her concerns. "Sir, I've been reviewing the flight paths, and I think there might be an issue with the extraction timeline." Morrison looked skeptical. "You the safety observer from Fort Hood?" "Yes, sir. Captain Mitchell." She spread the maps on the table and pointed to the extraction zone. If the primary landing site is compromised, your backup options are limited. The alternate sites require longer approach paths, which could leave the aircraft exposed to ground fire. Morrison studied the maps more carefully. What do you suggest? Additional backup sites, sir, and contingency plans for rapid extraction if the situation changes. I've seen similar scenarios where rigid adherence to the original plan created unnecessary risks. Something in her tone caught Morrison's attention. You sound like you speak from experience. Sarah hesitated. Her reputation had preceded her to brag, and not in a good way. I've done extensive analysis of helicopter operations, sir. Both successful missions and ones that encountered problems. Morrison nodded slowly. I heard about Fort Hood. You're the pilot who saved that family. I'm the pilot who disobeyed orders, sir. Yeah, I heard that part too. Morrison rolled up the maps and looked at her directly. But sometimes disobeying orders is exactly what the situation requires. The training mission launched 2 nights later. Sarah watched from the command center as multiple aircraft coordinated the complex operation. Everything went smoothly until the extraction phase, when a primary landing zone came under simulated enemy fire. The mission commander on the ground called for immediate evacuation, but the planned extraction route would take the helicopter directly over an enemy position. Sarah watched the aircraft hesitate, caught between following the planned route and improvising a safer alternative. Red Fox 2, you're cleared to deviate from planned route. Captain Morrison radioed to the helicopter pilot. Use your judgment and get our people out of there. The pilot immediately banked away from the planned extraction route and found an alternate path through a narrow valley. The mission was completed successfully, with all personnel safely extracted. After the debrief, Captain Morrison pulled Sarah aside. Your recommendations about the backup sites probably saved us from a real problem tonight. If that had been an actual mission, those contingency plans might have made the difference between success and failure. The pilots made the right call, sir. They adapted to changing conditions. With support from command, Morrison pointed out, the key is knowing when to trust your people to make the right decisions, even when those decisions deviate from the original plan. Sarah felt something click into place. She had been thinking about her incident at Fort Hood all wrong. The problem wasn't that she had made the wrong decision in a crisis. The problem was that she had made the decision without proper communication and coordination with her command structure. When they returned to Fort Hood, Major Hayes called Sarah into her office. I got a very interesting phone call from Captain Morrison. He was impressed with your work at Bragg. It was a good learning experience, ma'am. He also said something interesting. He said you seem to understand the balance between following orders and making independent decisions. That's not something I would have expected from your file. Sarah straightened in her chair. I've learned a lot in the past year, ma'am, about how individual decisions fit into larger operations, about the importance of communication and coordination. Major Hayes studied her carefully. I've been watching you, Mitchell. Your safety investigations show real insight into aviation operations. Your recommendations have prevented accidents. You've proven that you can think systematically about complex problems. Thank you, ma'am. I'm recommending you for flight status review. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. After a year of exile, she might actually have a chance to fly again. Mom, don't get your hopes up too high. The review board will be skeptical. You'll have to prove that you've changed, that you can be trusted with an Apache again. But you've earned the right to make your case. Sarah felt tears threatening and fought them back. I won't let you down, ma'am. See that you don't. The hearing is scheduled for next month. The Flight Status Review Board convened on a cold November morning. Sarah sat in the waiting room outside the conference chamber, her dress uniform crisp and her service record thick with documentation from the past year. Major Hayes had spent weeks helping her prepare, reviewing every aspect of her case, and coaching her on what to expect. Remember, Major Hayes had said the night before, they're not just evaluating whether you can fly. They're evaluating whether you can be trusted with the lives of other soldiers and the security of military operations. Show them that you understand the responsibility, not just the privilege. The board consisted of 5 senior officers, including Colonel Martinez, and 2 visiting officials from Fort Leavenworth. Sarah recognized the lead investigator from her original hearing, a stern-faced lieutenant colonel named Davidson who had recommended her discharge. Sarah entered the chamber and took her seat at the small table facing the board. The formal charges were read aloud: violation of direct orders, unauthorized deviation from approved flight path, endangering military personnel and equipment. Each charge carried the weight of her ruined career. Colonel Davidson reviewed Sarah's service record prior to the incident: her flight training scores, her performance evaluations, her potential for advancement. On paper, she had been an exemplary officer with a promising future in Army aviation. Captain Mitchell, Davidson began, a year ago, you made a decision that violated multiple regulations and put military personnel at risk. What has changed since then? Sarah had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now the words she had prepared seemed inadequate. She looked at the faces of the board members and decided to speak from the heart. Sir, I've learned that good intentions aren't enough. I made the right decision for the wrong reasons and in the wrong way. I was thinking like an individual pilot instead of thinking like part of a larger military system. Explain the difference, Davidson said. An individual pilot sees an emergency and reacts to save lives. A military pilot sees an emergency and evaluates how their response fits into the broader mission and command structure. I should have immediately communicated the situation to command and requested emergency authorization for the deviation. Colonel Martinez leaned forward. But would you have gotten that authorization in time to save those lives? It was a trap. If Sarah said yes, she was admitting her violation was unnecessary. If she said no, she was justifying her insubordination. She chose a different approach. Sir, I don't know. But that wasn't my decision to make alone. By taking unilateral action, I removed my commanding officer from the decision-making process and potentially compromised other operations that I wasn't aware of. The right course would have been to present the situation to command and trust the system to make the best decision with all available information. Davidson made a note and continued. Your year in the safety office has given you extensive exposure to incident analysis. What patterns have you observed in aviation accidents? Sir, most serious incidents result from cascading failures rather than single errors. One small violation of protocol creates conditions for larger problems. Success in military aviation requires systematic thinking and absolute adherence to communication procedures. The questioning continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of Sarah's case and her subsequent development. The board reviewed her safety investigations, her performance evaluations from Major Hayes, and the commendation she had received for her work at Fort Bragg. Captain Morrison had flown to Fort Hood specifically to testify on Sarah's behalf. He described her analytical skills, her understanding of complex operations, and her ability to balance initiative with proper coordination. The captain demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment we need in our pilots, Morrison testified. She could identify problems, develop solutions, and work within the command structure to implement them. That's the mark of a mature military aviator. Major Hayes provided the final testimony, describing Sarah's growth over the past year. She came to my office as a skilled pilot who didn't understand the bigger picture. She's leaving as someone who understands how individual excellence contributes to mission success. The board deliberated for 3 hours while Sarah waited in the corridor outside. She tried to read their expressions when they emerged, but their faces revealed nothing. Colonel Davidson called her back into the chamber. Captain Mitchell, this board has reached a decision. Your violation of orders was serious and cannot be overlooked. However, your conduct over the past year demonstrates significant personal and professional growth. Sarah held her breath. You are hereby restored to flight status with conditions. You will complete a refresher course in Apache operations under the direct supervision of a senior instructor pilot. You will undergo additional training in emergency procedures and command communication protocols. And You will serve a probationary period of 1 year, during which any violation of procedures will result in permanent grounding. Relief flooded through Sarah, but she maintained her composure. Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint you. See that you don't. You're getting a second chance that most officers in your position never receive. Use it wisely. As Sarah left the hearing, Major Hayes was waiting in the corridor with a slight smile. Congratulations, Captain. You've earned this. I couldn't have done it without your support, ma'am. The hard work starts now. Being restored to flight status is just the beginning. You'll have to prove yourself all over again, and some people will be watching for you to fail. Sarah understood the challenge ahead. Her reputation would follow her, and she would have to work twice as hard as any other pilot to prove she belonged in the cockpit of an Apache. But for the first time in a year, she felt hope. That evening, Sarah walked out to the flight line and stood beside one of the Apache helicopters. The maintenance crew was finishing their evening inspections, preparing the aircraft for the next day's training missions. The familiar sounds and smells of the flight line felt like coming home after a long exile. She ran her hand along the Apache's armored hull, feeling the power contained within the sophisticated machine. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of earning her way back into the cockpit. It would be a long road, but she was ready for the journey. 6 months later, Sarah was approaching the end of her probationary period when the call came that would define the rest of her military career. She was in the middle of a routine training flight with her instructor, Chief Warrant Officer Kelly, when the radio crackled with an urgent message. All aircraft, this is Fort Hood Control. We have a situation developing at grid reference 31 SUB 12345 67890. Stand by for further instructions. Sarah and Kelly exchanged glances. The grid reference was near the base perimeter in an area used for ground training exercises. Kelly immediately contacted the control tower for more information. Apache 77, this is Fort Hood Control. We have reports of a downed civilian aircraft approximately 2 miles northeast of your position. Emergency services are en route, but your aircraft is closest to the scene. Sarah felt her stomach clench. Another civilian emergency. Another chance for her career to be destroyed by a split-second decision. She looked at Kelly, waiting for orders. Fort Hood Control, Apache 77 requesting permission to investigate and assess the situation, Kelly radioed calmly. Apache 77, you are cleared to investigate. Maintain radio contact and report status. As they banked toward the crash site, Sarah saw the parallels to the incident that had derailed her career. But this time, everything was different. Kelly was following proper procedures, maintaining communication with command, and ensuring they had authorization for their actions. They found the wreckage of a small aircraft scattered across a rocky hillside. The plane had clipped a ridgeline and crashed into a steep ravine. Sarah could see 2 figures near the wreckage. One apparently tried to help the other. Fort Hood Control, Apache 77. We have visual on the crash site. 2 survivors visible. One appears to be injured. The location is inaccessible to ground vehicles due to terrain. Apache 77, medical evacuation helicopter, is 20 minutes out. Can you assess the severity of injuries and provide assistance? Kelly looked at Sarah. What do you think? Sarah studied the scene below. The injured person wasn't moving, and the other survivor was frantically waving at their helicopter. 20 minutes might be too long if the injuries were severe. We could set down on that flat area about 200 meters from the crash site, Sarah suggested. I have medical training. I could stabilize the injured person until the medevac arrives. Kelly nodded and radioed their intentions to control. Fort Hood Control, Apache 77 requesting permission to land and render medical assistance. We have a qualified medic on board. Apache 77, you are cleared for landing. Be advised that terrain in that area is unstable due to recent rains. Kelly executed a textbook landing on the small clearing. Sarah grabbed the first aid kit and ran toward the crash site, while Kelly remained with the aircraft and maintained radio contact. She found a teenage boy with a severe head injury and his father, who was in shock but relatively uninjured. The boy was unconscious with labored breathing. Sarah quickly assessed his injuries and began emergency treatment, stabilizing his airway and controlling the bleeding. For hood control, Apache 77. We have one critical head injury, male approximately 16 years old. Patient is unconscious with possible brain trauma. Recommend immediate medevac with trauma team standing by. Copy Apache 77. Medevac ETA 15 minutes. Sarah worked to keep the boy stable while his father provided information about the accident. They had been flying to a family reunion when the engine began making strange noises. The father had attempted an emergency landing, but misjudged the terrain. The medevac helicopter arrived precisely on schedule, and Sarah helped transfer the injured boy to the medical team. As the medevac departed for the base hospital, Kelly approached her. "Good work, Mitchell. You kept your head and followed procedures." "It felt different this time," Sarah admitted. Having proper authorization and coordination made all the difference. They returned to base to find Colonel Martinez waiting for them at the flight line. Sarah's heart sank, assuming she was in trouble again for becoming involved in a civilian emergency. "Captain Mitchell, I understand you provided medical assistance to an injured civilian today." "Yes, sir. Chief Kelly and I followed all proper procedures and maintained communication with control throughout the operation." Colonel Martinez studied her carefully. "The boy you treated is in stable condition at the base hospital. The doctors say your quick response probably saved his life." Sarah felt relief wash over her, but she remained cautious. "Just doing my job, sir." "Indeed. I received a call from Naval Air Station Pensacola. They're looking for an experienced Apache pilot to serve as an instructor in their advanced combat helicopter course. It's a prestigious assignment that would fast-track your career development." Sarah was stunned. Pensacola was one of the premier training facilities in the military. An instructor position that was typically reserved for the most elite pilots. However, Colonel Martinez continued, the position requires an endorsement from a flag officer, someone who can personally vouch for your character and judgment. Sarah's heart sank again. She couldn't think of any admiral or general who knew her well enough to provide such an endorsement. "Sir, I appreciate the opportunity, but I don't have those kinds of connections." Colonel Martinez smiled slightly. "Actually, you do. Admiral Richardson has specifically requested that you be considered for the position." The name meant nothing to Sarah. "Sir, I don't know any Admiral Richardson." "He knows you, Captain. Admiral Richardson's grandson was the boy you saved today. When he heard about what happened and learned about your background, he made some inquiries. Your story impressed him." Sarah struggled to process this information. The random chance of helping the Admiral's grandson had somehow led to the opportunity of a lifetime. "The Admiral was particularly interested in your incident from last year," Colonel Martinez continued. He said, and I quote, "Anyone willing to risk their career to save lives has exactly the kind of judgment we need in our instructors." Those 5 words from Admiral Richardson changed everything. Within a month, Sarah was reassigned to Pensacola, where she would spend the next 3 years training the next generation of Apache pilots. Her experience with both success and failure, with following orders and knowing when initiative was required, made her uniquely qualified to teach young pilots how to balance courage with discipline. The teenage boy she had saved that day made a full recovery and went on to become a military pilot himself, inspired by the helicopter crew that had rescued him. Sarah never told him about the connection between his accident and her career advancement. Some things were better left to fate. Years later, as she watched her students graduate and deploy to combat zones around the world, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this point. The mistake that nearly ended her career had ultimately taught her the lesson she needed to become not just a better pilot, but a better leader. The Apache helicopters continued to thunder across the Florida skies, carrying a new generation of pilots who understood both the privilege and responsibility of their mission. And Sarah Mitchell once banned from flying, had found her true calling in ensuring they were prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. Captain Sarah Mitchell had dreamed of flying the Apache helicopter since she was 12 years old. Growing up near Fort Campbell, she watched the powerful aircraft slice through Kentucky skies during training exercises. The thunderous roar of the twin engines and the deadly precision of the gunship filled her with an ambition that would shape her entire life. 20 years later, Sarah stood at the edge of the flight line at Fort Hood, Texas, watching her fellow pilots prepare their Apache helicopters for another training mission. Her flight suit hung in her locker, unworn for the past 6 months. The gold wings on her chest felt heavy with the weight of broken dreams and shattered expectations. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac as Sarah remembered the day everything changed. It had started like any other training flight. She was the co-pilot and gunner in the front seat of the Apache, with Major Tom Reynolds commanding from the back. They were practicing close air support missions, working with ground troops to simulate real combat scenarios. The exercise was going perfectly until the radio crackled with an emergency call. A civilian aircraft had suffered engine failure and was making an emergency landing at a nearby airstrip. The pilot was inexperienced and panicking. Local emergency services were 20 minutes away, but the Apache could reach the scene in under 5 minutes. Major Reynolds hesitated. Their orders were clear: stick to the training mission. Deviating from approved flight paths without authorization was strictly forbidden. But Sarah could hear the terror in the civilian pilot's voice over the radio. A young father with his 2 children aboard, desperately trying to keep his small plane in the air. Without waiting for permission, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her career. She took control of the aircraft and diverted toward the emergency. Major Reynolds protested, but Sarah was already banking the Apache toward the coordinates they had intercepted from the emergency frequency. They arrived to find a small Cessna spiraling toward a cluster of farm buildings. Sarah used the Apache's powerful searchlight to guide the civilian pilot toward a clear field. She talked him through the emergency landing procedures over the radio, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos unfolding below. The Cessna touched down hard but safely in the wheat field. The father and his 2 young daughters walked away without serious injury. Emergency services arrived minutes later to transport them to the hospital for observation. Sarah and Major Reynolds had saved 3 lives that day, but their heroic actions came at a devastating cost. By the time they returned to base, a full investigation was already underway. Sarah had violated direct orders, deviated from an authorized mission, and used military aircraft for an unauthorized rescue operation. The fact that she had saved lives didn't matter to the review board. The hearing lasted 3 days. Sarah sat in her dress uniform, listening as her commanding officers dissected every decision she had made that afternoon. They questioned her judgment, her ability to follow orders, and her fitness for duty. The Apache program demanded absolute precision and unwavering adherence to protocol. There was no room for cowboys who thought they knew better than their superiors. Major Reynolds testified that he had tried to stop her, that she had ignored his commands and taken unauthorized control of the aircraft. The investigation revealed that Sarah had a history of pushing boundaries, of making split-second decisions that sometimes conflicted with established procedures. They painted a picture of a reckless pilot who couldn't be trusted with the most sophisticated attack helicopter in the American arsenal. The verdict was swift and merciless. Sarah was immediately grounded from all Apache operations. Her security clearance was suspended pending further review. She was reassigned to a desk job in the base motor pool, managing vehicle maintenance schedules and parts inventory. The woman who had spent years mastering the complexities of attack helicopter warfare was reduced to filing paperwork and answering phones. The other pilots avoided her in the mess hall. Some whispered that she was a hero, but most agreed that she had gotten what she deserved. The military ran on discipline and order. Without strict adherence to the chain of command, chaos would follow. Sarah had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Months passed in bureaucratic limbo. Sarah's appeals were denied at every level. Her requests for transfer were ignored. She watched from her office window as new pilots arrived for Apache training, eager young officers who reminded her of herself just a few years earlier. They had no idea that the woman processing their equipment requests had once been considered one of the finest Apache pilots on the base. Sarah's career seemed over before it had truly begun. The dreams of combat missions and protecting ground troops were replaced by the mundane reality of military bureaucracy. She considered resigning her commission, but something deep inside refused to give up. She had saved those lives for a reason, and somehow, someday, she would fly again.